Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. What is a keyframe and where do we find them? And of course, here we're talking about PTE-AV-Studio. Keyframes are the driving force of all animation and creative audio-visual. Without keyframes, we have no animation. We'll only find them in the Objects and Animation screen after we've selected any image or video from the slide list or the timeline. Here we're viewing the timeline, but the Objects and Animation screen is just an isolated view of one slide or video from the start of its transition onto the screen until the final moment it leaves the screen. With that image highlighted, I can open up the Objects and Animation screen. And what we're now viewing is exactly the same as we saw just a few seconds ago. This Objects and Animation screen is an isolated view of just that particular slide I highlighted from the start of its transition, shown here, until the final moment it leaves the screen, shown here. And you'll notice whenever we select an image, a video, text or an object, one keyframe will be created automatically for us. With the Objects and Animation screen open, I've imported a small object, in our case a car. We can think of keyframes as waypoints, just like we may think of the waypoints in our satellite navigation. So each of the keyframes I've added here determines where the car will be when the cursor reaches that key point. Let me give you an example of that by stepping through each one of them individually. The first of my keyframes, at the very moment this image starts to appear on screen, tells the car where it needs to be. When the cursor gets to the next keyframe, the car will have moved from its original position to that position. And when we get to the third keyframe, it's now turning and going uphill a little bit. The next keyframe takes it a little bit further. The next one a bit further and straightens the car up onto a level road, and the final one actually drives the car off of the screen. And if I place my cursor back at the start and I press play, you can see the entire travel in real time. The speed of the movement is going to be governed by how far apart the keyframes are. Each one of these is around 4 seconds. It could be a lot less and the car would be moving faster. As well as controlling the animation of images, video, text and objects, keyframes can also control color changes, opacity and blur. Keyframes are displayed as a blue tag, as we've seen, and they can be clicked and dragged to any position on the timeline, or they can be positioned a lot more precisely using keyframe time over on the right hand side. So if I wanted my keyframe to be at the 4-second point here, I would put in 4000 into the keyframe time. The first keyframe is always created automatically for us, as I've already said, but we can create and or clone a keyframe as many times as we require. For example, here I could right click on that keyframe, and there I've got the opportunity to add a keyframe or clone a keyframe, and we have keyboard shortcuts too. If, for example, we wanted to zoom an image from the moment it first appears on screen until the moment it leaves the screen, we only require 2 keyframes or 2 waypoints. Generally speaking, this keyframe would be right at the start, and we could right click and either copy or clone a keyframe, and I can position that one right at the end. The first keyframe will determine the zoom factor of the image as it starts to appear on screen, and the second keyframe will determine the zoom factor at the end of that particular image when it's about to be replaced by the next image or video on our timeline. As you can see here in the Objects and Animation screen, the second of my two keyframes is currently highlighted. So if I go to my zoom factor here and I click and drag over the X to the right, I can zoom the image in. So in this case, when the image starts to appear on screen, we'll begin at this point, and throughout the slide duration, the image will zoom in. If I select that keyframe and double click the X to reset it, and if I go back to the first keyframe, select that and increase the zoom factor there, then of course as the image appears on screen, we're going to see it zooming out rather than zooming in. Now let's suppose we wanted an image or a video to be on screen for 15 seconds. If you look at the thumbnail I've got highlighted, on the bottom right corner you can see in fact the slide duration has been set for 15 seconds. Suppose we wanted a title to show over the top of this image for just 10 seconds of that 15. In that case, we'd need 4 keyframes or waypoints. Let's open this up into the Objects and Animation screen and see just how it's done. Once the image opens, we can see once again that the first keyframe has been created for us, but here we don't need this keyframe at all. We're going to be creating text. So the first thing we want to do is to deselect the image. The image, as you can see, has a highlight around the outside edge in the upper center, and we can see it highlighted in grey over on the bottom right. If we just click into no man's land here, the grey area outside the image, what we've effectively done is deselected the image because we're going to apply independent text. So let's go to the text tool and click the text type tool, and we can see exactly what appears on screen. A couple of things we've got to do. We need to position the text where we want it, type the words we want, and of course adjust the size too. Now if we look down below into the timeline with the text selected, we can see that that first keyframe has been created for us. What we may want to do next is to go over to the right hand side and making sure we've got the Properties tab selected, because if we were selected in the animation we wouldn't see the box we need to change the font color and also type our title. So in the Properties I'll overtype that with something simple, and because it's quite a dark image I'll also change the color here to black. Now, two things I've got to do. I need to adjust the size of the text, and I also would like to position the text where I want it to appear. Now for that we do need to go into the Animation tab, and I can click and drag, or I can use the tools up at the top right, but I'll click and drag here. Putting my cursor on that little center spot, I'm going to move my title up to that sort of position. But I will go to the zoom. I'm going to put my cursor into that box, and I'm going to use the cursor control keys, and if I hit the down arrow, as you can see, I can adjust the zoom down or up, whatever is my need. I want it to be somewhere around that sort of size. I think that's going to be fine. Now we need to look down at that first keyframe. because remember what I was setting up here. The overall slide duration of the beach scene is 15 seconds. So what we need to do is to decide where the first keyframe is going to be located. Well, we wanted this to be on screen for about 10 seconds of that 15. So if we were to subtract 10 seconds from 15, obviously we're left with 5, but we've got to distribute that 5 both at the start and the end of the slide duration. I may have the timings a little bit wrong here, but that's easy to adjust once we've created the actual effect we're looking for. So my first keyframe would need to be positioned somewhere around 2.5 seconds from when the base image first starts to appear. For this little exercise, I will use keyframe time. So I'll overtype the value here with 2005. What I'll do next is to right click and clone the keyframe. How long do I want it to take for the word "the beach" to appear on screen? Experience tells me a second, maybe 2 maximum. Let's make it 1 second, which means the second keyframe needs to be at the 3.5 second point, 3500. So between the first keyframe and the second keyframe, we can't see any difference at all. But on the first keyframe, we need to go over to our opacity. I'm going to right click over the letter A and set it to 0. So what I need to do next is to select that second keyframe, right click and clone it, and that needs to be positioned somewhere around 13.5 seconds. So 13500, there we can see it nicely placed. And of course the opacity for this is correct. We need it to be fully visible on screen. But now over the next 1 second, if we right click and clone the keyframe yet again, and we position that just 1 second away, now the opacity for that keyframe needs to be set at 0. And there we have our animation. If I put my cursor back at the start and press play, the image will appear on screen, then the text will appear. It'll sit there for quite a bit of time here, between 3.5 seconds and that 13.5, probably a little bit too long, and then fade out. But of course, once we've got it created, fine-tuning what we've got is pretty easy. Because what we can do here is we can now adjust the position of these keyframes to give ourselves a better result. And we can move keyframes more than one at a time. So for example, with the first 2, if I select the first one, hold the Control key and select the second one, I could move these into a position. Let's move this into a position about 6 seconds. Doesn't have to be precise. Then if I do the same here, I'll select the last and the third, and I'll drag this one to somewhere around about 10 seconds. That gives 4 complete seconds for this text to be on screen, which I think is going to be more than enough time. In fact, in some instances, it could be even a little too long, but as you can see, very quick and easy to change. So if I put my cursor back at the start, remember when we're looking at the timeline, this grey bar is the transition length of the image we're viewing here as it comes onto the screen. The one at the other end is the transition of the next image, which effectively will remove this. Although we don't see the effect of those transitions in the objects and animation screen, that grey bar is something we need to keep our eye on, because we do know that the image is going to be well on screen before the text appears. So we can enjoy the beach scene. Then we're told the title of the presentation. We've read it, we're looking around the beach, it fades away. We enjoy the picture for a few more seconds, and then we would be moving on. So each image, video, text or object can have its own set of keyframes and therefore be animated independently of each other. The 4 keyframes we've just set up for our text is the basis of all animation and creative presentation. Now I say creative presentation because we can use keyframes to control, let's say, a black and white image, which then turns into a coloured one. But it actually has no physical animation. As you're about to see with this next example, if we need to use large quantities of text, we may decide to use the scrolling technique that we see on TV and movies. It's a fairly simple 2 keyframed animation, but the important thing is to make sure the text doesn't scroll too fast or too slow for the average viewer. There's nothing worse than being forced to read too fast or have the scrolling text so slow that it becomes tedious. It's a fine balancing act, and we need to get this right. And that little bit of text took something like 50 seconds. Now, as I bring you into the Objects and Animations screen again, we can take a look at how this is created. If we look to the extreme left, we can see the grey bar. We know that the transition on screen is 2 seconds. Therefore, if the first keyframe is set, or the keyframe for the text is set at 4 seconds, the scrolling doesn't begin until that point. And if we look way up to the extreme top right, what I've used here is the pan Y to just take the text from its normal position to just outside the frame at the bottom. You can see some 50 seconds later at the second keyframe, now I've got an exact opposite pan Y to take the text off at the top. And as long as we get this timescale right in relation to the amount of text we have, then it should scroll at a sort of level where we can just about read it comfortably. I think I got mine just about right, but maybe even that was just a little bit fast for some people. As you can see here, I brought you back into the main screen of the software. If you're looking to learn more about keyframes, I'd like to make a suggestion here. We can use slide styles. I've highlighted an image from the slide list here. I'm going to go down to my Styles and Themes button. Making sure I've got the Styles option selected, I'm going to go to my Captions and I'm just going to pick one. Caption, bottom, pan right, bottom right, center. I want this one because it's going to pan a little bit. Down at the bottom right, we can even put our own caption if we wish, but I'll just leave that as it's set and I'm going to apply that slide style. Now let's take a look at how that's created by highlighting the image and opening up the Objects and Animations screen. First of all, we've got a shadow being created by the author. Let's ignore that for the moment because all we're interested in is the text. When I select the text, you can see it's got 4 keyframes. If I select keyframe 1, we can see the text is way off to the left. We can see the bounding box. And if we look over to the right to the Animation tab, we can see the pan X up at the top right there is showing something like 134 or minus 134. That's what takes it off to the left. If we look down further, we can see the opacity is set to 0. Well, we can't see it, so we know that. But it's also got a degree of blur too. So if I pick up that cursor and I move it to the right, you can see what's happening. Between the first keyframe and the second, now you can see the caption comes back solid, and when I highlight the second keyframe and we look over to the right, now the pan is bringing it back almost to the center point. The opacity's been returned to 100 and the blur has been taken away. Now if we move between this keyframe and this one, we can see instantly what's happened. There's a little bit of movement of the caption to the right, but nothing else. But between this keyframe and this keyframe, then we're going to get a similar thing to we saw at the start, where it's going to go off to the right. It's going to blur and fade as it moves off screen to the right. The opacity is set to 0, the blur's 30, and it's virtually panned almost off the screen. And I don't know if you noticed there, but there's even a little bit of animation applied to the background image, and it's all been done in that slide style. There's the image at the start, and it's slowly panning from right to left as the caption appears. This is a great way to see just what keyframes are doing. So there we have the basics of keyframes, what they are, what they do, how we create them. I'll see you next time.